Hey everybody, Mrs. Mazzola here. Just came inside from enjoying some sunshine, and it is time to drop some math knowledge. So first, we got to start with our joke. We're going to be looking at different kinds of lines today, so our joke is line related. Here we go. Parallel lines have so much in common. It's a shame they'll never meet. If you don't understand what that means, you will in a minute. So our lesson today is going to be on parallel, intersecting, and perpendicular lines. And most of our lesson today is going to be about some vocabulary, because most of this stuff is just knowing what the words mean to be able to recognize if you've got that kind of line. But before we can even figure out the types of lines like parallel, intersecting, and perpendicular, we have to know what lines are and what makes up those lines. So we got some vocabulary to go for first. So let's take a look at the definition of line first. What is a line? A line is a straight path. Oh, better pause here just in case. You might want to grab some paper for your notes if you haven't done that already. And you can pause the video at any time. If I'm going too fast, just pause it so you can write down the definition, or you can always go back. Okay, so a line is a straight path that goes on forever in two directions. And that might seem like a lot of words for something that you already know. So let's draw an example of it just to be safe, because that can be a little confusing with those words. So a line is something that goes on, it's a path, a straight path that goes on forever in two directions. And that's why we put these arrows here at the ends of our lines. That is showing people that even though we've stopped drawing it, that line could go on forever and ever in those two directions. So that's why it's a straight path that goes on forever in two directions. Okay, so when we have a line, it continues to go whether we stop drawing it or not. But the next one we want to look at is a line segment. So it's a little bit like a line, but it's a little bit different. A line segment is part of a line with two endpoints. So what that means is instead of drawing arrows at the end of our lines, we're going to show that it's going to stop. We want a segment or a section of a line. So a line segment would look something like this. We have one endpoint, another endpoint, and then a straight line or path connecting those two endpoints. And this would be a line segment. And a lot of times you'll see these will have letters on them. So this would be called line segment AB, because those are the names of the points on either side. So when you have a line segment, that means you've taken a piece of a line. If it was just a regular old line, we would see those arrows going out forever and ever. Okay, and the next term that we want to talk about is a point. And most of you know what this is, but there's a kind of a fancy math term that we're going to talk about with it. So with a point, it is a location on a flat plane. And that's a fancy definition for a spot on a flat piece of paper. Because if it wasn't on a flat surface or a flat plane, it wouldn't be a point anymore. If you take a circle and you make it 3D, I bet you know what it is. If you guessed a circle or a sphere, you are correct. Okay, so a point looks like, gee, I don't know if I can draw this one. Oh, there we go. Give me a nice big old point. It's a flat circle. Okay, now that we know what makes up these lines that we're going to be comparing, we've got lines, line segments, and points that all help us to make these parallel, intersecting, and perpendicular lines. So the first one that we're going to look at is intersecting lines. Now, some of you might recognize that word, like your parents, when they're driving, they say, oh, I got to be careful in this intersection. Well, it's exactly like our definition of intersecting lines. It's where that name comes from for the intersection for driving. So an intersecting lines are lines that cross over each other. Okay, and if we want to draw an example of this, you would just draw two lines and you would make them cross over each other. They could be random little lines. So I'm going to draw a line that looks like this, and then I got a line going like this. And intersecting means that they cross each other, okay? So if you took a view of our city, there are some places where our intersections look like this, and it's not a super pretty intersection, but there are some of them that are not quite so wonky. But as they get less and less wonky or less and less weirdly connecting, they become some other kind of line, and we'll get to that in a minute. So intersecting lines cross over each other. The other type of line that we're going to talk about is a parallel line. And parallel lines, this one may be a review for some of you. Parallel lines are lines that never, ever, 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 never cross. And this is where that joke came from at the beginning of the video. They have so much in common. They're both straight lines. They have so much in common, but they never meet. They never cross. So parallel lines are lines that always and forever, even if we continue to draw them over and over and over, all the way off the paper on either side, they would never ever cross each other. They would never touch at all. Think of it like train tracks. If you see train tracks that are going along the side of the road, they may curve or bend, but they're always the same exact distance apart, and they never cross over each other on the same tracks. Otherwise the train would, tip over. It wouldn't be pretty. So those parallel lines always stay the exact same distance apart from each other, and they continue to go, okay? And they can go any kind of direction. You can have parallel lines going sideways like this, as long as they're the exact same distance, exact same like diagonal size. You can't have parallel lines though. For example, you can't say, oh, well, they're parallel because they're going like this. Well, if you look at the gap here, that gap changed. It's big at the top up here and it's smaller at the bottom. So eventually, if I extended those lines, those things would cross and they would be intersecting lines. They wouldn't be parallel anymore. So even though they're not touching yet, doesn't mean that they are parallel. If I extended my lines, and that's where you can always test them if you're never sure about lines, whether they're parallel or intersecting or perpendicular, if they're not touching yet, extend them. Take your ruler or your pencil and just continue the lines a little bit and see if they cross or how they cross. Okay, so we're going to erase that because we don't want that as an example, because that is not parallel lines. And our last one is perpendicular lines. So we were talking about those intersections up here, and we were talking about how they're wonky and kind of cross weird. And when they stop being so wonky, that's when we get perpendicular lines. And perpendicular lines are, oops, wrong color, hold on, are lines that make right angles at the point where they cross. Okay, so these are those non-wonky intersections that we see a lot in Spokane. They're the ones that are perfect T's. They look like lowercase t's. So we would have our lines looking like this. And the way that you can know for sure, or if you're signaling to somebody else that you wanted to draw perpendicular lines, because let's be honest, making perfect right angles is like nearly impossible unless you're being super nitpicky. But the way to show that to somebody, if you want them to know it's perpendicular, or for someone else to tell you they're perpendicular, is you'll see our right angle symbol in the corner of one of the angles, or it might be in all of them. But most of the time it'll be in just one of them to show you that, hey, I meant for that to be a right angle, which means that these are perpendicular. And perpendicular lines, just like with parallel lines, they don't have to be straight up and down all the time. If you take a perfect T and you turn it a little bit sideways, what do you get? You get an X. They're still perpendicular, and you would still know that because somebody would show you in your X, they would have the arrows like this, and you would have your symbol somewhere on one of these that told you it was a right angle at that cross point so that you knew it was perpendicular. Okay, so now that we have all of these definitions, we can take a look at some examples and classify or determine or name what kinds of lines those are. So we've got three choices. We've got intersecting lines that cross each other any way that they cross each other except at perfect right angles, they'll be intersecting. We've got parallel lines that no matter how much we draw them, they will never ever touch or cross. And perpendicular lines that cross at a perfect right angle. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. Let's look at this first one right here. So this first set of lines that we've got right here. If I weren't sure what was going to happen with these, I could take my pencil and I could extend them a little bit. And I would just take my ruler and I would draw a little bit longer to test my theory. And I see, man, I keep drawing longer and longer lines with that. And they don't seem to be doing anything. They just keep going and they never touch. Well, if we look back at our definition, which lines never touch or never cross? You're right, parallel lines. So we would call this set of lines parallel lines. Okay, and then let's take a look at our second one. This guy right here, it's X looking and it's crossing. So we've got two options there. We've got intersecting lines and perpendicular lines. So if we look at our two options, intersecting lines cross and perpendicular lines make a perfect right angle where they cross. So let's take a look at our option. Does it have a right angle symbol in it? You're right, it does, it's right there. So that means that they're not intersecting. In this case, they are perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines. All because of that perfect right angle right there in the middle. Okay, let's take a look at two more. These are going to be a little bit more challenging. These are the ones that haven't touched yet or don't touch yet, and we have to figure out what they might be. So if we take a look at this first one over here on the left, there we go. Those lines aren't quite touching yet, but I'm not sure what they're going to do. So this is another case where I want to extend my lines and see what happens. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to extend my lines a little bit. So this one's going this direction and this one is going like that. And oh my gosh, look what just happened. They're crossing right here. Now, when you are extending your lines on something that hasn't touched yet, you have to use your math brain to figure out whether this angle right here in the middle is a right angle. And if we take a look, I'm going to draw this a little bit thicker in a different color so we can see it. This angle right here in blue where they crossed, does that look like a right angle to you? If I turn my head kind of sideways and look at it, I've got a side like this and then the other one's like this. Now, if you remember our line types from last week, that is not a right angle. I don't have a perfect corner. It looks like somebody sat on it. So if this isn't a perfect right angle, I do not, oh my gosh, it erased my lines. It does not, there we go, have a right angle where it meets. So they're not going to be perpendicular. These are going to be intersecting lines. And I tested that by drawing them out and seeing if they had a right angle where they met. Now let's continue that with our last example over here on the side. These don't touch either. I can tell by the directions they're running, they're probably not going to be parallel because one's going this way and one's going this way. And for parallel, they kind of got to be running the same direction. So that rules that one out. So they're going to either be intersecting or perpendicular again this time. So let's take our pencil and we're going to extend our lines. So we've got this one that goes out like that, and this one extends like this. And that is some really bad line drawing, Miss Mazola. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay. Now again, we have to figure out whether those angles in the middle are right angles to know if it's intersecting or perpendicular. So let's take a look. I'm going to highlight it in blue again. And if we look at it, does that look pretty dang close to a right angle? Yeah, it does. And you'll be able to tell a lot more on paper because they are like straight. Mrs. Mazzola's lines aren't like super straight. So looking at this one, this does have a right angle measure in the middle there. So when they meet, they would have a symbol like that. And we would know, since they have a right angle, that makes them perpendicular lines. Okay. So when you're looking at lines, ladies and gentlemen, as you do your assignment, make sure that you're careful and have these notes next to you with your definitions or have the video ready to play again so that you can see the difference between these. Parallel lines, once you know what the word means of never touching, those are easier to recognize. But the tricky part is knowing the difference between intersecting and perpendicular. Okay, I always like to think of a little word trick with perpendicular. Sounds like another word that starts with per that makes it a perfect right angle. Perpendicular, perfect right angles, okay? So maybe that'll help you remember the difference between intersecting and perpendicular lines. Then you might have to extend some lines just to be safe on which one you're choosing. Good luck, mathematicians.